Hi, everybody. All right, I'm going to go into gallery view so I can see everybody. It's been a while. I know you guys can hear me as people start to come on in. Let's see, admit all, admit all. Looks like everybody's coming in. All right, so I guess, it's been a long haul of COVID, so I'm sure everybody knows how to use Zoom. But just as a reminder, it's useful for you guys to be in speaker view and to keep yourselves muted until I ask for, here we go, until admit all. Oh, I didn't want to do that, admit all. There we go. Until I ask for input. It is lovely to see everybody's faces and names from across the country, from California to Colorado to Massachusetts to New York. I know we've got people from all over the place here. I know people like Ivan are just here for the Zin. I know some of you guys are Pinot lovers. Andy is right here from Petaluma, just north of me. We have Dr. Pampa up north of Sacramento, representing Northern California. And hi, Arnold, also representing Northern California. So welcome everybody, and I'm really glad that we're here. I think I've got everybody in. All right, so in the past, I've always started these by just asking 3 people to just unmute themselves, to introduce themselves, to say where they're from, and to share what they're drinking, whether that's a glass of water or whether that's a glass of wine, whether it's an IPA or vodka on the rocks. And since we have some new people with us today, who haven't been to one of my Zoom sessions before, I thought I'd call on some new people. So I know Sadal is here from Washington, D.C. So you don't have to turn on your camera if you don't want, but if you want to, you can. But do you want to unmute yourself, introduce yourself, tell us what you're drinking and where you're from?
Hi, everybody. So I'm Sadal. It is 8 p.m. where I am in the DC area, so just getting out of dinner, washing dishes. So sorry for the camera. But yeah, in the DC area and drinking Stag's Leap Merlot at the moment. But can't wait for the 2 bottles I just bought this morning.
Awesome. Well, Merlot is always plush and plummy and delicious. So it sounds like you made a good choice. Let's see, who else have I not seen in the virtual waiting room, in the virtual sessions before? Well, I know I haven't seen David Pampa. So why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself, tell us what you're drinking, how is your air quality, and say hello.
All right. Hi, Kara. Air quality is good. We got a good offshore wind delta breeze going, so we're okay. I'm living in Rockland, California. Been here for about 3 years after moving from Santa Rosa. And I'm drinking one of your 2018 Gaps Crowns.
Oh, the 18 vintages, I think, across the board are excellent. Anytime you see 18s, pick them up. It was a really mild, almost perfect growing season. So I would recommend that.
Good. Yeah, it's good.
Awesome.
Good to see you.
Thank you. You too. Say hi to Sandra. All right. Oh, and congratulations on having #1 off to college. Well done. Okay, so I was going to, you're welcome. And I was going to find someone who's not in California. So how about Ed and Carrie Price representing the Midwest?
Hello.
Hey, Kara, how are you?
Hi, I'm good. How are you two?
Good. We're in beautiful Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And for those of you that don't know where it's 90 miles north of Chicago. And it's a wonderful fall night here, about 70 degrees. So we're sitting outside on the deck, eating dinner. And having a little Diora Pinot Noir.
From Monterey.
From Monterey. Yeah.
Awesome.
And we're looking forward to seeing you in about a month.
I am looking forward to you guys too. That's going to be a lot of fun. And just as a plug, I know some of you have visited me in Sonoma already, and we love hosting visitors. We love sharing Sonoma hospitality. So if you're going to be in Northern California, please reach out so we can set up a tasting. I'm really excited about today's virtual session because it's the first one I'm doing where the topic was generated by you. I was asking for topics that were of interest, and everyone says to me, how do you know when to harvest? How do you know when to harvest? And it's a complicated question, right? The short answer is It depends. It depends on the style of wine you want to make. It depends on where you're located. It depends on the weather. It depends on all kinds of things you can't control, like Mother Nature, labor, and tank space. So without further ado, why don't we jump in to the educational component, and here we go. So hopefully everyone can see my screen and play from start. So harvest parameters. How do we decide when we pick, and why do we pick when we do? So over here you can see a picture of the Torrey Hill Vineyard Pinot Noir that we picked on Monday, and we can talk about the parameters under which I made that decision. But you can see the fruit looks beautiful. And one thing just to note here, I might talk about dimpling. And down here in the foreground, you can see these Pinot grapes that look the weeest bit wrinkled. So that's a sign of maturity. It also can happen with dehydration. It will concentrate the flavors. And you can see that's not really the majority of the fruit, but that's one of the signs that I look for when I say, oh, it looks like there's 5 or 10% dimpling out in the vineyard and those clusters are starting to soften. That's another parameter that you can use to think about what it means to be ripe. So here we go. So, you know, really the most important decision that any winemaker makes is, when are you going to pick the wine? Because obviously once the grapes come off of the vine, you can't put them back. And, you know, then you're stuck working with the grapes that come in at that specific acidity, with that specific tannin level, with that level of ripeness or immaturity, and that sugar level. And of course, as everybody remembers, sugar drives the alcohol. So when you pick, really drives the style of the wine. So if you're looking to make a plush, fruit-forward, rich, luscious Merlot, you might decide to pick at a slightly higher Brix than someone who's sitting on the extreme Sonoma coast, who's looking to do a very, very high acid, lean, razor focused style of Pinot Noir, because all of those stylistic choices are driven by essentially the sugar and the acid. So the level of ripeness when we pick. And all grapes evolve along the same flavor spectrum, at least red grapes, roughly so. And when the sugars are low, as they just start to develop their flavors, they're generally in a red fruit category. So that might be pomegranate, cranberry, strawberry, alpine strawberry. And then as they get a little bit more ripe, that flavor profile progresses. And it's going to move into things like raspberry, then riper raspberry, boysenberry, blackberry, all those really ripe berry aromatics. From there, you slowly can sort of move into plum. And then as you get very, very ripe, you're going to move into prune and then raisin. So that sort of gives you a bird's eye view of how flavor development is an indicator of ripeness and how it drives final wine style. You know, and of course, this really is sort of an overview. Every single vineyard is different. Every microclimate is different. But that's the bird's eye view. And I guess before we dig deeper into the Zoom slides, we should sort of talk about the 2 columns of ripeness. So on one hand, one of the most important factors, of course, is sugar, right? And most of the sugar in the grape is glucose and fructose. It's a 6-carbon sugar. It gets broken down by yeast to make ethanol. The other component that we talk about is physiologic ripeness. And that's really an umbrella that encompasses both acidity and tannin. So you'll see when we look at some graphs that as grapevines progress through the season and as grapes accumulate sugar and get riper, that sugar is going to go up. And in tandem with that, the acidity is going to drop. And in general, as the acidity drops, the pH goes up. So how can we measure these things? Well, one way is easy. We can just take it to a lab, and they have really expensive equipment that can measure those things for us. We can also do all kinds of quick and dirty measurements at home on our own. And you may have seen pictures of me with an ocular refractometer up to my eye, and that measures the soluble solids. We winemakers in the United States use a scale called Brix. In the EU, they use a scale called Bohm. They're just sort of both different scales of ripeness that look at soluble solids. And in a grape, when you squeeze it, most of the soluble solids are going to be glucose and fructose. So soluble solids and specific gravity is an excellent proxy for sugar. So here we go into the next slide. Right, so we talked about the fruit profile, how the sugar drives the alcohol, and how the ripeness drives style. So here's like the really big grand list of all of the different factors that I can think of that drive ripeness. And there's some of the easy things that we talked about that you can guess, right? Like taste, how does it taste? Anthocyanins and color, right? When grapes are unripe and you squeeze them in the bag, you don't get a lot of color. And as those grapes become more ripe, when you go out to sample and you squeeze them in your little Ziploc bag, you're going to see more and more color. Then in the other column, you see all kinds of things like tank capacity. So for example, if everybody's fruit in Sonoma County is sitting right around 22 Brix, and then we get 10 or 12 sustained days of heat, and suddenly everyone's like, we have to pick now, and picking isn't spaced out, you might have an issue with tank space availability. As you know, there's a labor shortage as well. So labor shortages in the past, and I'm sure this season too, will also drive picking decisions. Of course, things like weather, if it's going to rain. I mean, we really do want rain here because we're in the middle of a drought. It would just be nice if it can hold off till the end of harvest. But if there's going to be rain, you may decide to pick. On the other hand, out in the Heinz vineyard where I get my Chardonnay, it's so cool out there. It comes in long after the Pinot Noir, and it's really close to the coast in this sort of little cold pocket. And it will often rain once or twice before I bring in that fruit. And I had to really get used to living with the anxiety of having my Chardonnay hang out through that rain. And Charlie, the vineyard owner, used to have to talk me down from the fence. And I said, Charlie, it's going to rain. He's like, yes, it's going to rain. I'm like, what are we going to do, Charlie? We're going to wait, Kareth. We're going to wait until it's ripe. What do you mean, Charlie? So, now I'm a little bit more zen about it. I remember one year with the Rock Piles Zinfandel, I think it was 15 or 16. It rained probably 4 days before I picked it, and it was quite ripe. So I called it the divine water ad from God. So, sometimes it works out to your advantage. So let's keep talking about parameters. So again, this is really what I talked about, right? So the amount of sugar that you start with in your grapes is going to determine that final alcohol level, right? And so here you have a pretty picture of glycolysis, which is, the yeast breaking down 6 carbon sugars into ethanol. And we can use some quick and dirty math, which I had shared with my friends the other day, that generally, if you multiply the Brix times 0.575, you can get a sense of what your final alcohol will be. If you're really concerned, you might check this again during fermentation, because as that sugar is consumed, depending on how much sugar has been consumed, you can check the alcohol then and see how much sugar you have left, and you'll have an even more accurate snapshot of what your final alcohol is going to be. And of course, you can see that these numbers differ from red and white wine at the bottom. And does anyone have any thoughts about why the factors of multiplication might differ between white and red wines? You can unmute and shout it out if you have an idea. Anyone? All right, so it has to do with the evaporation of ethanol, right? So when we ferment red wines, we ferment them in those big tanks, right? With those open tops. And sometimes if you lift the fabric lid off those open tops, when you punch it down, you'll see all of this water that's condensed on the top of the lid on the hat. And a lot of that is ethanol as well. That's gone up there with the water. And because we ferment in these big open top tanks, we have a lot of that ethanol can volatilize and just go off into the air. In contrast, of course, when we make white wines, it's made in a closed vessel. So you don't get that exodus of ethanol floating up into the sky attached to water vapor the way that you do with fermenting red wine, which is why one year when I made rosé, I had calculated it to be, oh, I don't know, I thought it was going to be 13.5 or 13.7% alcohol. And that was the first year that I made everything together in like a closed tank instead of in individual smaller barrels. And much to my surprise, that first batch finished at a significantly, shockingly higher alcohol. And luckily I had a second batch and we blended them together. But like nobody wants 14.2% alcohol rosé. So that was definitely a good learning lesson that put the theoretical to practical use. All right. And then here's just another cartoon showing glycolysis. And, you know, this is from Dr. Watson's article on grape berry development. But what I really like about this slide is it really puts everything onto the same graph, right? So we talked about this. So here we have sugar. Sugar, you know, grapes go through 3 different phases. But anyway, so they slowly accumulate sugar. And then during the peak of fermentation or the peak of ripening, they accumulate that sugar very quickly. You can see this line going up. And then, you know, as the canopy starts to yellow, as the grapes reach their physiologic peak, they actually stop accumulating sugar. So you could leave those grapes out there until December and you're going to get diminishing returns. The reason that the sugar keeps going up happens to be from dehydration, not because the grapes are actually producing more sugar through photosynthesis. So that's important to remember too. And then of course, the other parameters that we talked about, right? Like, so here you can see berry size, and you can see that it tapers off, right? Because the berries dehydrate over time. You can see anthocyanin, right? That's an indicator of color. That's the color tannin goes up as the grape gets ripe. pH, of course, goes up as the acidity drops. And really, the goal with picking decisions is finding when all of those factors are in balance so that the sugar and the flavors are bright, the acidity is still high, and you know it will lift and carry the wine through the lifetime of the wine aging, that the pH is in a reasonable range, right? Because the pH is really important for color, for microbial stability. You don't necessarily taste pH as much as the acidity, but it drives a lot of the things that keep your wine stable. And of course, here we have veraison. For those of you who don't know, veraison is when the grapes go from green to red, and then we go through ripening. So how do we measure the sugar? And again, it's both qualitative and quantitative, right? So we can go to the vineyard, we can pick a sample, we can send it to the lab, you can use your ocular refractometer and measure the sugar. But then of course, that also has to go in tandem with how does it taste? Does it taste delicious? Does it taste appropriate for the style that you want the wine to be? And if you've had my San Giacomo Vineyard Pinot Noir, you know that that's sort of a quieter, more elegant, lighter, sort of Burgundian inspired style of Pinot Noir. And to me, that vineyard tastes really good at a slightly lower Brix. In contrast, especially in the early days of Sobrano's Vineyard, when it was just a young, just born, just producing vineyard, it really didn't start to have significant flavor development until you got into 25, even 26 Brix. And so I was picking at a higher level to get that flavor development. And as the Sobrano's Vineyard has aged, so, you know, it was planted in 06, my first crop was in 2010, as that vineyard has gotten past her, 10-year growing anniversary, it's been developing color and flavor significantly at lower Brix, which has been really fun and exciting to see. All right. So I talk about sort of the Parkerized style of like really, really ripe, rich, fruit-forward wines being picked at a much higher Brix than something like San Giacomo. And again, Brix drives the style, right? So San Giacomo, I pick at the lowest Brix, Gap's sort of in the middle, and Santa Lucia Highlands is a Pinot Noir with big shoulders, a big sexy mouthfeel, so I picked that at a slightly higher Brix. And then we can talk about the acidity, right? Which is sort of one of the the other pillars, right, under physiologic ripeness. And again, there's really two big analyses that we're looking at. We're looking at TA, that's the titratable acidity, and that's composed of two kinds of acid. There's malic acid and there's tartaric acid. And then we're looking at the pH. And again, in general, the level of TA, the titratable acidity that you have in juice or wine is really what you taste. Whereas for me, I think pH really drives things like color, stability, your ability to cold stabilize wines, right? So, you know, from a science perspective, it's important to know that the first proton of tartaric acid comes off at 3.5. And just, you know, wine is a buffer, right? So if you're starting at a nice low pH, your wine's generally going to live there for the course of its life. And if you're starting at a higher pH, it's really darn hard to get that pH down no matter how much acid you add, because it's a buffer. The wine's going to be like, I don't want to live here. You can dump 100 pounds of acid into me, and I'm not going to do what I want you to do. So again, that picking decision is really, really critical for what we do. And here you can see, right, that these grapes are clearly underripe. So that's why I put this picture in here, because you can see these berries are still very rosé, and this cluster next to it has nice, deeply colored grapes. Can anyone guess what varietal that might be in the last picture? So we have grapes that are totally underripe next to grapes that are super duper black, probably on their way to being raisins. Shout it out. What ripens super inconsistently? Anyone?
Zinfandel?
Zinfandel. It is notorious for being a pain in the butt for uneven ripening, and it's just something you have to live with. All right. So yes, indeed, you were right, Ed. It was a picture of Zinfandel. So tannins and anthocyanins, you know, the qualitative part of tannin analysis is much more salient on the Napa side for people who are making Cabernet. I really don't know any Pinot Noir winemakers who measure tannin levels quantitatively in the lab. But in Napa, it's very, very common with Cabernet. So oftentimes they're trying to reach a threshold so that the tannins are high enough to give it, you know, the style, that they're looking for over doing a Napa cab. So you can actually send your wine to a lab. You can measure the level of anthocyanins. You can measure the level of tannins. I actually did that early on when I was doing an experiment with submerged caps in Sobranes. So that was kind of fun. But that's not something I regularly do. Although I always assess tannins qualitatively. So anyone want to shout out, where do the tannins come from? Anyone want to? Mike, go for it.
Skin and stem.
And one more?
The seeds, skins, and stems.
You got it. Absolutely. From the skins, the stems, and the seeds. So in certain years with Sobranes, I'll do whole cluster and I'll do stem inclusion, because I think that having those tannins from the stems, if I'm fermenting in an oak tank, can help build mouthfeel and mid-palate. And I like it because it can bring forth more sort of savory tea notes and help build structure. But if you add stems that are looking really, really green, you're going to get unpleasant, unripe, chalky notes in your mouth. So there's always sort of a yin yang decision of, am I going to put in stems? Am I going to not put in stems? And for me, it's often a game day decision. Does the rachis look really, really nice and brown and toasty? If so, it might be a good idea to put in some stems. If they look neon green, it's really just going to bring an underripe edge to everything that you do. And then we talk about skins, right? So I'll go out in the vineyard and I'll chew on the grapes and chew on the skins. And again, it's like chewing on the stems, not super pleasant. But if they're very underripe, they have a really sort of chalky, stick to your tongue, unpleasant character to them in a severe bitterness. And as those skins get riper, the quality of the tannin in your mouth changes. The same is true for seeds. Seeds we inspect both visually. They go from neon green, like is green is the little light on the top of your laptop. Like they are neon green when they are underripe. And as they progress, they go from like green to halfway brown. And at the end, when they're very, very ripe, they're toasty brown. And it's important to have ripe seeds because seed phenolics can be really, really bitter. And for the most part, we don't destem we destem, but we don't smush our Pinot grapes before we ferment them. But remember, at the very end, we take them all and put them in the press. So when you press wine, when it's done, you can start to extract those seed phenolics. So you better know whether those seeds that you started with are really green or really nice and toasty. Let's see here. All right. So again, so here are some of the things that we talked about with maturity. And here you can see the rachis turning nice and brown. I put this other picture in here on the left to show basil yellowing in the canopy, basal canopy loss. That's another sign of physiologic maturity, and also a sign that, you know, your vineyard is starting to crap out, right? So once those leaves go yellow, you're really not going to get active, useful photosynthesis. And again, this is the point where rather than the grapes doing photosynthesis and accumulating more sugar, you're likely only going to be concentrating the sugar through dehydration. We talked about cluster softening and dimpling. I showed you that picture really early on, basal canopy yellowing, seeds, lignification, and color. All right, so sampling. So you can go out to the vineyard and pick all the grapes and clusters you like and get a number in the lab. The numbers are going to represent your sample, and your sample is only as good as being as representative as it is in the vineyard. So when I go out and sample, and most people go out and sample, there's sort of two camps. There's the berry camp of people who pick individual berries, and the cluster camp. I'm in the cluster camp. I like to get a whole cluster because I find that if you just pick individual berries blindly from different clusters as you walk down the row, the only ones that come off easily are the ones that are ripe and easily disengage from the rachis. So you can get a false high or a false sense of maturity that's not yet there. I also like to have whole clusters because it gives me the opportunity to leave those grapes, the grape juice and the smushed up grapes in the bag and let them sort of stay on the skins for an hour or two to see if it's going to soak up a lot, sort of give me a crystal ball into what the cold soak is going to look like. Again, you want to pick from the morning side and the afternoon side, from the sunny side, from the shady side. You should be picking blind. You shouldn't go to a row and be like, wow, that's a good cluster. I think I'll take that one. It's supposed to be blind. Don't pick from the end rows. Don't get clusters from the vineyard posts. Choose multiple rows and have your sample be representative, because if your sample is representative of the whole vineyard, then you're going to get a really much better overview than if you're only sampling one row. Let's see. And okay, so those are things that are in your control, right? So of course, things that are out of control are tank space, labor, natural disasters, unfortunately, and weather, I should have said too. And so every vintage is unique. So what is interesting about 2021? I think across the board, I think it's going to be a really delicious crop. I think it's going to have a lot of concentrated flavor. Obviously, we're sitting in a drought, and the drought is so severe that a lot of us were, all of us winemakers and grape growers have been in discussions about climate change, about drought since pre-bud break. So it's top of mind for everybody. Nobody has the perfect right answer. I think across the board, we started irrigating earlier, much sooner than we typically would, because the water levels in the ground were lower. You know, so you're always fighting wanting to have a big leafy canopy that gives you a lot of photosynthesis, balanced against the idea of water rationing or not being wasteful of water and resources. I think the crop's a little bit light. We had a few frost episodes. In the spring, we had really sort of erratic growth with tall shoots and short shoots. We had like a lot of some sort of mid-cane shatter on stuff on Pinot that was cane pruned. But across the board, whether it's Zin, whether it's Pinot, whether it's Cab, it seems like it's going to be a slightly lighter crop. And again, I also think that's probably due to the drought. The vine can only set the fruit that it can sort of handle to ripen. Let's see. I think we're near the end. Okay. So here, this is fun. So here's a real life analysis. So this is the information that I got yesterday. So I go out and I sample gaps once or twice a week. And then the vineyard management company, Atlas, has their crew go out and sample. So they'll sample my block, which is a really big block, you know, so like 300 rows or something, and they'll send me that data. So this is the data that I got. So let's take a look and see what they're talking about. So look, it started back here on 8/17 and the sugar was 19.7 and the acidity was 9.3. Let me tell you, that's very, very, very high. You do not want to drink that. It'll take the enamel off your teeth and your dentist will kick your ass, kick your butt. The pH is super low, right? So this is not ripe by any indicator. The sugar is too low. The pH is so low. This would never even go through malolactic. It's so low. The bacteria would be like, no, I can't take it. And the acid's really, really high. So they sample about a week later. The sugar hasn't changed. And you might think, oh, that's weird. The pH came up a little bit. Okay, so that's a reasonable trend. But look at this acidity. How did it go from 9 to 6 if the pH only crept up and the sugar didn't change? Well, like clearly that's operator error, right? So you have to take all these numbers with a grain of salt. The acid did not go from 9 to 6. Like 6 is getting close to ripe for acidity. It didn't drop that much if the sugar didn't move at all and if the pH just like crept up incrementally. That doesn't make sense. A pH of 3.12 does not correspond to an acidity of 6.8. So that's sampling error. And then let's take a look at what happened in the numbers they sent me yesterday. So here you can see the bricks suddenly jumped to 23.2 and I'm like, oh my goodness, I usually pick around 24.5, 24.7. Boy, maybe I'm like a week or 10 days away and it's only August 31st. And then you look at these other indicators and you're like, that pH is still awfully low. And that acidity is back where it was 2 weeks ago. So what's going on? So I think this is really an indicator of dehydration and the heat that we had over the weekend. So we really, rather than having sort of nice moderate weather, we did have some hot days, nowhere near as hot as it was in like 2015. We had some really hot days in 17 and 19, but it was hot. It was warm for gaps. So I think that those heat spike days caused some dehydration and caused the sugar to jump up. And my hunch is that with watering in the vineyard, and now that it's been nice and cool and we've had this great fog layer and a lot of moisture in the air, the vines are going to recalibrate. And if you go out and test it a few days later, then you're going to get a number that's really a much more accurate representation of the vineyard. And sure enough, I went out this morning and I checked the sugar and it's like 20.8 or 21, which is a lot more reasonable. So now you're going to ask me, like, what are the numbers that you pick at? So generally, Pinot Noir is usually picked between 22, 23, and 25 or 26. Brix usually goes up about 1.5 points a week if we're having nice, moderate, temperate, sunny, 80, 85, low 90 degree weather. The grapevines will shut down above 95, 96. They just stop doing photosynthesis. They close up their stomata. They're like, it's too hot. We can't do this. And that's really when you get dehydration as opposed to actual sugar accumulation. I happen to like high acidity wines or higher acidity wines because I think they're good with food and they age well. So I usually I'm delighted when the pH is 3.65 or less because that's the pKa of tartaric acid. And I also sort of like to be around 6-ish on the acid, within a 5 to 6.5 when I pick, because I know that once you put it into the tank and you cold soak it, the acid's going to drop off and the pH is going to go up. And that's especially true for young vines like Tory Hill, like our new vines, as they grow up, especially last year, the acidity looked great. We put it in the tank and then suddenly the acidity was like, and that's just what young vines do. Let's see, I think I have one more slide with the numbers for Tory Hill, and then I can field questions. Do you nail it every time? Not so much. So here's an example with San Giacomo in 2015. It was much riper sugar-wise than I would have wanted. 2015 was a really early year. It was a high sugar year. Of course, that was the vintage that got like the, championship scores from Wine Spectator, which is jokes on me. And Tory Hill this year, I was aiming for 24.5. It came in at 25 bricks. The acid looks pretty good. And I feel like I nailed that pH. The seeds were really, really ripe. We had some lignification of the rachis. So I feel like in terms of the physiologic ripeness and the sugar ripeness, they matched up really well. And we picked it at a good time. So now I'm happy to field questions. let's see, alcohol contents of your latest releases that you tried to obtain. Organic chemistry is fun, Donna, if you're making wine. Dimpling and, okay. So let me start at the top. So dimpling is a much, comes before raisoning, right? So dimpling is just a little bit of minor dehydration as the clusters start to soften up as they get ripe. Raisoning is exactly what it sounds like. They are like full on raisins. You'd like to avoid having raisins in your tank because as you can imagine, if you put a raisin into water, it's going to plump up and all that sugar is going to be released and it's more sugar than you want. The same thing happens in your tank. If you have Zinfandel with raisins, they just keep releasing sugar and your yeast are like Sisyphus going up the mountain and they try to consume it and then they think they've done it and then there's more sugar and it never ends. So that was a great question. Let's see. Chuck, I do not remember offhand the alcohol content of these releases. I can tell you that the Zin is under 15% because I really always try to have the Zin under 15% alcohol. So it's balanced. It's not wimpy. It's certainly higher alcohol than the Pinots. I think the Chardonnay is probably 13.8 or 13.9. The 2020 vintage was a hair riper than the 19. It's got a nice roundness to it, although it was just bottled. So it's a just born baby. I'm sitting here with the 18 Torrey Hill. So if I put on my reading glasses and I look for where the alcohol, 14.3. So usually the gaps, the Torrey Hill and the Sobranos are usually a little bit above 14% and the San Giacomo is a little bit below 14%. And usually the Chardonnay is also below 14% and the Rosé as well. So hopefully that answered your question. I definitely got some jokes about how much I like glycolysis in yeast. It's true. What else? We have about 5 minutes. I try to keep these to 45 minutes because I know people get wiggly. I'm happy to talk about the release wines for 5 minutes. There's also a video that you can watch on your own time, or I can field questions. If people have questions about current vintage, past vintage, you can just unmute and shout them out.
Yeah, maybe 5 minutes on the current release.
Sure, that would be great. So why don't we start with the most recent release? So the most recent vintage is the 2020 Chardonnay, which I'm excited to get out into the market. Of course, everyone remembers 2020 for natural disasters, for fires. So I can tell you that Chardonnay handles smoke in the atmosphere like a champ. So number one, white wines are processed differently than red wines. So they're not on the skins and those compounds live in the skins. So when you make white wine, you smush the grapes right away and get rid of those skins. In addition to that, of course, I was testing for smoke markers all the way up to harvest. And I shared my data with all the big wineries. So I reached out to my friends at Williams-Salem, to people at Costa Brown, to people at Senses, to all the other winemakers who were sourcing from Heinz Vineyard, and we all had clean numbers. So that said, I'm really excited. The aromatics are super duper duper pretty. It's got sort of that pastry, brioche. It's got some really lovely honeysuckle, a little bit of orchard fruit and citrus. It's a really pretty Chardonnay. It was just bottled at the end of July. So if you're ordering Chardonnay, my suggestion is you drink your 18s and 19s and hold that 20 for a little while. The next Pinot is Chewy's Label Debut, which is the 2019 Torrey Hill. It's got a beautiful color. It's what I'm drinking now. It's got a really pretty, some sort of high tone, maybe even a blood orange character now that it's been open a little bit. Loads of cherry, cinnamon stick. As it opens up, it becomes increasingly perfumed. I was having anxiety before this started because I opened it and it didn't smell perfect. And Brian's like, it's a 19, you just opened it. You gotta relax. It'll come around. And it's already drinking beautifully. It's lovely on the palate. It's got tons of black cherry. It's just a super easy drinking, easy to pair with food kind of Pinot. It's really good. The 18 Sobranos, I think, is a real winner. It's showing beautiful integration of fruit and the oak barrels at this time. For those of you who like a more, some of those really earthy notes that I often get in the Sobranos, the 18, I think, has slightly fewer of those earthy notes, but it's got beautiful integration and aromatics. It's really luscious on the palate, and I think people are going to love it. I think it's going to be a crowd-pleasing vintage. I think people are going to love the 18 Sobranos. And for Ivan, last but not least, the Zin. The 19 Zin has a lot of the same characteristics as the 18. I think it's got a little bit higher acidity, a little bit more focus on the palate, which for me is good because I think it's going to age really, really well. It still has that beautiful color. It still has all of that ripe berry, ripe plum, blackberry pie character that we love from Zinfandel, along with that minerality that you get with Rockpile that really keeps it balanced and food friendly. But I think this one's going to be, I think this is going to be an ageable Zin, the 19 vintage. Came in at a slightly lower sugar and higher acid. So I prefer to work with that kind of Zin in the winery because it's less tricky from a production fermentation standpoint. And I just also think it's more balanced. So I'm very excited with the 19 Zinfandel. So we're at 5:43 and I try to end on time. Do we have, I said, oh, let me see if there's new messages. Someone said, I can't believe I bought this label just because of Chewy. Thank you, Sidal. Yes, we do call him Chewy, the marketing collie. And I'll be sure to add an extra Chewy sticker in your thank you note. And then someone said, Nick and Shireen are having the 14 Sobranos. Oh boy, I haven't had the 14 Sobranos in a while. So my original vintage of Sobranos was, I think, 2010 was my first Sobranos. And then I think that's when I did a submerged cap, or maybe that was 2011. But I think like the 14, the 16, when I've tasted them in the past, have both been tasting great. I opened an older Sobranos with someone. Mike, was that you or was that an older Gaps? Was that a Sobranos or Gaps? Do you remember? Oh, you got on mute. Mike, you got on mute. We can't hear you.
It was a Gaps.
Oh, it was a Gaps. I think it was a 14 though, wasn't it?
I think so.
Yeah, it was a 14 Gaps, and that was tasting great, which is a plug for come visit me. Sometimes we open up library wines. Chewy is label worthy. Thank you, Chuck, for the glasses. Yes, my reading glasses, they're peepers. I'm online. Let's see. Wish I had some Gaps. Yes, the Gaps is always a delicious, crowd-pleasing favorite. Everybody,
Karen,
yeah.
Karen, you just got a 92 from Spectator on the 2019, was it Sobranos, as I recall. So you obviously had to send that off to get looked at well before you're ready to release it. What goes into that kind of decision?
Oh, it makes me so irritated because I purposefully hold back the Sobranos for 6 or 8 months after the Sonoma Pinots because I think the Sobranos, because when it has whole cluster, when it has more base note and a slightly higher percentage of new oak, it just takes more time to integrate in the bottle. So I want to get it to you when I think it's really tasting balanced and integrated. I'm very blessed that lots of different reviewers ask for my wine. Spectator asks, and they always ask for things before I want to release them. So sometimes I send them in, sometimes I don't. Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. So I sent them the 19 Sobranos, and yes, it got a 92. So I'm really happy about that. That said, the 18 in the release got a 93 from Antonio Coloni at Venice, and he tasted it within a more normal time frame. So it's nice to have awesome scores, you know, a year before I'm going to release the wine. It's definitely confidence building. But again, it's one person's palate on one day. So, but
Absolutely.
yeah, so, you know, I'm like I said, I'm super lucky that I have all of you who support and love what I do. And I'm lucky that I have reviewers who actively ask for my wine to taste it in a lineup with all kinds of other producers and winemakers whom I respect tremendously.
Hey, Kara,
So, yeah.
I've got a quick question for you.
Yeah.
If I remember correctly, didn't you say that you made a wine from Anderson Valley?
Yes. Yes, so I did in 2020. So that will come next year, I think. So with the 2020, fires, the way they shook down, I'm very conservative. There are definitely people who made wine from vineyards near mine or at mine, which is a choice that was different than the harvest choice that I made. That said, I decided to go back to Anderson Valley, where I used to make Pinot Noir and loved making Pinot Noir for the 2020 vintage. And I got really lucky. I picked up there like the day of the heat wave. We were up there like 4 a.m. It was actually freezing cold. I was sitting in the car and we came down the mountain and dropped into Sonoma, and like by the peak of the day in Anderson Valley, they had a heat spike and it was like 100 degrees. So that was really lucky on picking time. And of course, it was well before there were any fires up in the Mendocino area. So that was lucky too. I'm really excited about it. The aromatics are lovely. It's got beautiful red fruit. I think people are going to love it. I was tossed up on whether to make an Anderson Valley this year. I was like, yes, no, yes, no. In a way, I'm glad I didn't. It's been a really challenging year in terms of water management, both in Sonoma and especially in Mendocino. So maybe in 2021, if we have an El Nino year with lots of rain and the water table goes up, I'll go back to Anderson Valley next year.
I sure wish we could send you some of our rain from here in Houston. And
Oh my goodness, bottle it up and send it to me in a UPS box.
along with the mosquitoes, though.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. But I'd take mosquitoes with some water. My goodness.
I hear you.
All right, you guys. Thank you for your support. Thank you for your time, for being here. Email me if you have suggestions for other topics, because I'm always happy to talk about wine production and yeast and glycolysis. So cheers, everybody, and have a wonderful, wonderful night. Thank you again.
Cheers.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks, Gareth.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Of
Sarah.
course. Thank